A man accustomed to luxury decides to disappear under the appearance of someone the world has learned to ignore, without imagining that his own trap would reveal much more than simple rude employees. In a single night, the impeccable hall of a Millionaire restaurant transforms into a stage of contempt, public humiliation, and cruel gestures that expose the darkest side of those who smile only at those who seem important. But in the midst of coldness and falsity, a courageous and deeply human attitude emerges, capable of challenging orders, breaking the silence, and changing the fate of everyone involved. Only what seemed to be just a test of character soon becomes the discovery of a secret so rotten and dangerous, hidden within the restaurant itself, that nothing will ever be the same again. Before listening to this shocking story until the end, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to follow more intense reports full of twists and truths that come to light when no one is prepared. Renato Cavalcante stopped the car 2 blocks from the restaurant. Not the car that everyone knew, that black SUV with a driver that used to park at the entrance of Noir while the valets hurried to open the door. He stopped an old car, a white Gull with a dented bumper that he had rented 3 days earlier, using the name of a trusted employee. He turned off the engine and stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror for a long moment. The face looking back at him was unrecognizable. A week-old beard, left to grow carelessly, discreet makeup that deepened the dark circles under his eyes and gave his skin a grayish tone. His hair, normally combed with precision, was disheveled and dull. The clothes were from a thrift store, a faded nylon jacket, jeans frayed at the knees, sneakers with the soles peeling at the tip. He had spent the afternoon walking the sidewalks of downtown so that the clothes would smell of the city, of asphalt, of restless physical effort. He was 46 years old. He owned 7 restaurants in Sao Paulo, 2 in Campinas, and 1 in Florianopolis. The Cavalcante Gastronomia Group turned over about 80 million reais a year. His name appeared on the lists of the most influential entrepreneurs in the sector, and his photo had been on the cover of a business magazine less than 6 months ago. And now he was sitting in an old car, disguised as a homeless man, about to enter his own restaurant to find out what was happening inside. The idea had been born from a series of disturbing coincidences. First, an anonymous message sent through the website's contact form, without identification, saying only that there were things happening at Noir that he needed to see with his own eyes. He dismissed it as a complaint from a competitor or a resentful employee. Then a loyal client, the wife of a senator, called personally to say she had lost her watch during a dinner and that the security guard had been rude in saying they were not responsible for belongings. It could also be a coincidence. But then came the financial report for the last quarter. The numbers match. They always match. That was what bothered him the most. In any audit, in any analysis his financial team performed, Noir presented impeccable results. Healthy margins, controlled inventory, waste within expectations, service praised in online reviews. Everything very well stitched together. Too perfect for a restaurant that served 200 people a night in the middle of Rua Oscar Freire. Renato had learned from his father, a small merchant from the interior of Minas, that when the numbers are too perfect, someone is hiding the imperfect ones. And when he started looking closer, he realized he couldn't see the backstage, not the real one. He saw reports, he saw presentations, he saw meetings where everyone smiled and explained everything with technical vocabulary and well-assembled slides. But he didn't see what happened when no one important was looking, so he decided to look. He got out of the car slowly, as if his feet hurt. He rehearsed his posture, hunched shoulders, head slightly low, the look of someone who spent the day in the sun without eating properly. He walked along the irregular pavement of the side street until he turned onto Oscar Freire. The Friday night movement was intense. Well-dressed couples, groups of executives leaving other restaurants, valets in line, soft music coming from inside the establishments. Noir was in the middle of the block, with its facade clad in dark stone and amber lighting that spilled warm light onto the sidewalk. Outside, 2 valets talked while waiting for customers. A security guard in a dark suit was discreetly positioned near the entrance. Renato recognized the guard from afar, a man named Dirceu who had been hired 2 years ago. He had never exchanged more than formal greetings with him. Now he needed to pass him as a stranger. He approached the entrance with a slow step. He felt the guard's gaze even before getting close. It was that kind of look that classifies before asking, that decides before hearing. Dircho crossed his arms and took a half step forward, blocking the way without physically blocking it. The body language of someone who already knows what they are going to say. Renato didn't wait to be stopped. He looked at the door with a tired expression and said he wanted to go in to ask for water. Dircho responded, without hesitating, that this was a restaurant, not a fountain. There was a snack bar on the corner. Renato said he was thirsty and just wanted to sit for a moment. Dircho took a firmer step and said he was occupying the entrance and that he needed to leave. A couple arrived right behind. The security guard changed instantly. He turned, flashed a smile, and greeted the two by name. "Good evening, Dr. Fabio. Good evening, Dr. Claudia. Your tables are ready." And he personally led them to the door, as if they were guests in his own home. Renato observed everything. He took a deep breath, and then he pushed the door slightly and entered. The interior of Noir was exactly what the name promised. Dark walls, point lighting over the tables, white flowers in tall vases, the discreet instrumental music that had been chosen by a consultant specializing in sound ambience. Every detail had been thought out to create an experience of exclusivity. Renato had personally approved every choice years ago when he inaugurated the restaurant as the jewel of the group. What happened in the following seconds was something he didn't expect to feel. Not the judgmental gaze of the nearest customers, although that happened. Not the waiter who approached quickly with a closed expression, although that also happened. What hit him was something deeper. The sensation of being invisible and visible at the same time. Invisible as a human being, visible as a problem. A young waiter in a black vest approached with quick steps and a low but firm voice, saying that this space was reserved for customers with reservations and that he needed to leave. Renato asked only for a glass of water. The waiter replied that water was served with a meal, and a meal required a reservation. When Renato insisted, saying he was very hot and that it wouldn't take long, the waiter leaned in slightly and said with a coldness that gave him chills that he should go look for water in the fountain at the square, which was 3 blocks away. At that moment, a woman stood up from a side table. She wasn't a customer, she was an employee. White apron, hair tied back, the expression of someone who carries the entire shift on her back and still maintains something human in her gaze. She had stopped organizing the cutlery on an empty table when she heard the waiter's tone, and something in her wouldn't let her continue pretending she hadn't heard. Renato watched her without moving. She was about 30, maybe a little more. A face with simple, tired features, but with a direct way of looking that contrasted with the hunched posture of someone who spends hours carrying trays. She didn't look at him with pity, and that was what surprised him the most. It was a look of recognition, as if she saw a person there and not an inconvenient situation. The waiter turned his eyes to her with a warning expression, but she didn't back down. She asked Renato in a calm voice if he had eaten anything. He said no, that he had been hungry since noon. It was a lie, but he needed to understand how far she would go. She nodded slightly, as if making a silent decision, and said she was going to get something for him. The waiter took a step toward her and said in a low but audible enough voice that she was looking for trouble. She didn't respond. She walked toward the kitchen with firm steps, the empty tray under her arm, and Renato stood near the wall, feeling the weight of every gaze that crossed the hall in his direction. It was in the next 3 minutes while waiting that he understood what had gone wrong at Noir. It wasn't a financial management problem. It wasn't inventory diversion. It was something harder to audit, harder to fix. The restaurant had developed a culture, an invisible culture in reports, silent in meetings, but brutally present in the way every employee acted when they believed the owner wasn't looking. And that night, in thrift store clothes and a dusty face, Renato Cavalcante was looking for the first time. Simone returned from the kitchen with a small plate, bread with butter, a thin broth in a porcelain mug, and a glass of water with ice. Nothing elaborate, exactly the kind of thing any person with common sense would have offered to someone who said they were hungry. She put everything on a tray, came out through the side door of the kitchen, and indicated a chair near the wall to Renato, far from the central tables, in a corner that the waiters used to fold napkins during breaks. Renato sat down. He pretended to eat with difficulty, slowly, like someone who hasn't eaten for hours. She stood for a moment, as if evaluating whether she should leave or stay. She stayed. She said her own name without him asking. Simone. She also said she had missed dinner because the shift was heavy, and that she understood when the stomach clenches. There was something in this speech that wasn't theatre. It was the simplicity of someone who never learned to pretend they don't see. The waiter who had tried to expel Renato passed a few meters away with a high tray and cast a look of censure toward Simone. She didn't turn her head. She remained standing, adjusting the cutlery at a nearby table as if that were part of normal service. Renato watched the waiter disappear toward the back of the hall and sensed that he hadn't gone to get a tray. He had gone to warn someone. 3 minutes later, the shift manager entered through the side corridor with a long stride and a closed expression. Renato knew her by name, Patricia Ramos. She had been promoted to manager of Noir about 18 months ago by the general manager, Helio Drummond, a man in whom Renato placed maximum trust since the group had grown beyond what he could manage alone. Patricia had impeccable references on paper, a strong presence, a history in luxury hotel chains, no record of formal complaints in HR, the kind of resume that ends discussions. What Renato saw now was different from the resume. Patricia Ramos crossed the hall with the precision of someone who is used to making calculated scenes, and what she did in the following seconds was not resolve a situation. It was create a spectacle. She stopped 2 meters from Simone, completely ignored Renato's presence as if he were part of the scenery, and said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear that the establishment was not a charity and that an employee who served food without registration and without charging would have it deducted from their salary. Simone responded calmly that she had brought basic items and that she would pay for the meal herself. Patricia said that wasn't the point. The point was that rules were rules, and that Simone seemed to have had difficulty with that concept for some time. Some customers were already looking, not discreetly, but with that open attention of someone watching something that shouldn't be public and therefore cannot look away. Renato remained motionless. Inside, he felt a growing anger that he had to hold back with both hands, because revealing who he was at that moment would break everything he still needed to see. Patricia then turned to him for the first time. The look she cast was not simple contempt. It was something more sophisticated, absolute indifference combined with controlled irritation, as if he were a stain on the carpet that someone had let pass. She told him in a firm voice that the establishment did not have the capacity to serve him that night and that he needed to vacate the space immediately. Renato said he was eating and would leave soon. Patricia said there was no soon, there was now. Simone intervened with a slightly altered voice, saying that the gentleman was almost finished and that she took responsibility for the situation. Patricia looked at Simone for a long second and then, in a gesture that made the entire hall hold its breath, pushed the tray with her fingers. The broth spilled, the bread fell on the floor, the glass tipped over and spilled water on Renato's shoe. The sound of the broth hitting the wooden floor was small, but the silence that followed was immense. No one on the team moved to help. 2 waiters who were nearby looked at the floor and then the other way, with that trained skill of not seeing what is inconvenient. A table of 4 executives on the other side of the hall laughed in a low voice. Another customer took out their phone and pointed it discreetly toward the scene. Simone was the only one who knelt down to pick up the fragments of bread from the floor. She moved slowly, as if she needed a moment to decide whether she was going to cry or not. She didn't cry. She stood up with the bread in her hand, placed it on the tipped tray, and stood with a posture Renato would never forget. Shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted, eyes watery but open. It was the posture of someone who had been humiliated and refused to bend. Patricia had already turned her back and was walking back to the corridor with the same long stride of someone who had just resolved a minor administrative problem. Some customers returned to their conversations. The waiter who had warned Patricia reappeared with a real tray and passed by the corner without looking to the side, as if nothing had happened. Renato stood up slowly. He told Simone in a low voice that she didn't have to do that. She replied, still with her back turned, that everyone needed something every now and then, and that she couldn't pretend she didn't see. She said this without drama, without expecting an answer, and went toward the kitchen carrying the tray with the spilled broth. He stood for a few more seconds in the corner of the hall, not out of hesitation, out of calculation. He had entered that restaurant expecting to find inattentive or poorly trained employees. He had found a hierarchy of cruelty that functioned with precision. And he had found a woman who, without knowing who he was, had decided to be decent in a place where that clearly had a cost. Renato sat back down, now in the chair closest to the wall as if waiting for the moment to leave. But his eyes roamed the hall with a completely different attention than that of a tired, homeless man. He was cataloguing every employee, every reaction, every detail of the environment that the reports had never shown. From where he was, he could see the flow of the entire hall, the distribution of the tables, the corridor leading to the kitchen, the discreet door at the back that must lead to the administration. He observed how the waiters moved, fast and attentive at the central tables, where the customers were obviously recognized or seemed especially well-dressed, slower and less cordial at the peripheral tables, where the customers were anonymous. There was a hierarchy of attention that was in no service manual he had approved. It was a hierarchy created by habit, cultivated by the absence of consequences. In 20 minutes of silent observation, he saw a waiter ignore a signal from a table for almost 8 minutes, while talking to a colleague near the counter. He saw a glass of wine being discreetly replaced after a customer complained, without any apology being made. He saw Patricia appear twice in the side corridor, not to supervise the service, but to talk in a low voice with one of the internal security guards, both looking at the hall with a type of attention that wasn't operational. It was evaluative, as if they were monitoring something specific. Renato couldn't identify what, but there was something in that look that didn't fit within a simple explanation of team management. It was the look of someone waiting for a moment, not someone supervising a shift. As he looked, a feeling grew in his chest that was no longer anger. It was that cold mixture of disappointment and determination that accompanies someone who realizes the damage is greater than they imagined. He had entered Noir expecting to find arrogance and sloppiness. He was beginning to suspect there was something more organized than that, something that functioned in the shadows of the very business he had built with years of work, and that, until that night, he had believed he knew inside out. It was around 10 o'clock at night when the situation changed direction in a way Renato had not foreseen. He was still in the corner when he heard a female voice rise from the other side of the hall. A woman with tied-back red hair, well-dressed, around 50 years old, raised her hand and called a waiter urgently. Her bag had disappeared. It was on the chair next to her at the beginning of dinner, and now it was no longer there. She was sure she hadn't forgotten it anywhere, because she had checked before ordering dessert. The waiter called another waiter. The second called a third. In less than 2 minutes, there were 3 employees around the woman's table, while she narrated the situation with a progressively louder voice. Other customers began to pay attention. The murmur of the hall lost the tone of conversation and gained the tone of a situation. Patricia reappeared with that speed that indicated she had been warned even before the woman finished explaining. She came from the side corridor, heard a quick summary from the waiter, and then turned to the hall with the expression of someone who already knows what they are going to say before investigating anything. And then she did something that took Renato a second to process. She pointed toward the corner where he was sitting. Not with her finger, with her head. A subtle gesture almost disguised in a natural tilt of the neck, directed at the internal security guard who had been in the corridor with her earlier. The guard understood without words. He began walking toward Renato. The red-haired woman looked at where the guard was going and said, with a conviction that seemed to come out of nowhere, that she had seen that man near her table when she went to the bathroom. She said this with that certainty of someone who just convinced herself, not with the precision of someone who kept a memory. A man in a grey suit sitting 2 tables from her nodded, saying he also thought it strange for a man like that to be in there. Renato remained completely still, inside the character, but his mind was working at full speed. The security guard stopped in front of him and said he needed a talk. It wasn't a question. 2 other employees positioned themselves a few meters away, creating a geometry of blocking that made it clear there was no discreet exit. Renato looked up and said he hadn't touched anything. The The guard said it was just a talk. He said it in a tone that meant something else. Patricia approached and said in a loud voice that the establishment's protocol required that anyone present in an incident of loss of belongings be identified and searched. She said the word searched with a precision that was almost legal, as if she had practiced that phrase. The red-haired woman crossed her arms and agreed vigorously. It was at that moment that Renato felt it. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation. Something lightly touched the right side of his jacket at the height of the lower pocket. So fast and so light that if he hadn't been with all his senses on maximum alert, it would have gone unnoticed as the natural brushing of someone passing nearby. He didn't turn his head. He continued looking at the guard. But he registered the face. One of the young waiters, the same one who had stood near the corridor with Patricia, had passed behind him at that instant with an empty tray, and the movement of the tray had covered the action of the arm. He had placed something in his jacket pocket. The clarity of this arrived with a coldness that was almost geometric. It wasn't a suspicion, it was a certainty. And what it meant was much bigger than a missing bag on a Friday night. It meant that what was about to happen was not a misunderstanding or an exaggeration by an authoritarian manager. It was a setup, calculated fast, executed with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. The security guard said he needed to check the jacket. Renato didn't respond immediately. He looked at the hall. More customers were looking now. There was a phone filming openly at a corner table. The scene was exactly what Patricia had set up. A cornered man from the streets, an indignant victim, a luxury environment contaminated by an unwanted presence. The narrative was ready before the twist. Simone appeared at the kitchen entrance. She had heard the hubbub and come out to see what was happening. She stood at the door, the empty tray against her chest, and her eyes went straight to Renato, then to the waiter who had passed behind him, then back to Renato. He saw in her face the exact moment she understood what had happened. It wasn't the slow comprehension of someone arriving at understanding. It was the recognition of someone who had already seen something similar and therefore knew how to identify the signs. Her expression changed. The tiredness of the shift, the restraint of someone who had been humiliated an hour earlier, the caution of someone who had much to lose, all of that was still there. But there was something else too emerging from underneath, with the slowness of someone who needs a moment to decide if they are going to be brave again. Patricia turned to the security guard and told him to proceed. The guard extended his hand toward Renato's jacket, and Simone took a step into the hall. She said with a firm voice but without shouting that she had seen what had happened. She said she had seen Diego and called the waiter by name, pass behind the gentleman with the tray just as the argument started. She said she had seen the movement of the arm. She said all this in a single breath, standing in the middle of the hall, with the tray pressed against her chest as if it were the only shield she had. The hall went silent. Patricia turned her face to Simone with a slowness that was in itself a threat, and she said, in a voice that had lost any pretense of administrative formality, that Simone was forgetting who she was and who was in charge there. She said that was the second time in the same night she had meddled where she wasn't called, and she said that maybe it was time to discuss if there was really a place for her on the Noir team. Simone didn't sit down. She didn't retreat. She stood in the center of the hall with the tray against her chest, eyes open, and replied that she had said what she had seen and that she wasn't going to undo that. Renato looked at her for a long second, and he made the decision he had been postponing since he entered the restaurant, not to reveal himself. Not yet. There was something he needed first. He needed real witnesses, not just his word afterward. He needed more people to see enough so that the truth couldn't be swept under the carpet with a well-assembled story about a disciplined employee and an intruder who had created trouble. Because if there was one thing the last half hour had made absolutely clear, it was that the people who managed Noir were very good at assembling stories. That's why he remained seated. That's why he didn't speak yet. He let the tension of the hall weigh in the air for a few more seconds. He let more eyes turn to the scene, more phones be raised, the silence become solid enough so that anything said now would echo far beyond the walls of that hall. Only then did he slowly take the cell phone out of the inner jacket pocket, not the cheap phone he had bought to use as a disguise. The real phone, the one he used every day, with the black case worn at the edges that any senior employee of the group would recognize instantly. He typed a short message to Claudio Mendez, his personal lawyer, who lived 8 blocks away. 3 words: "Come now, Noir." Then he put the phone back in his pocket and waited. Because the night had not yet shown everything it was hiding, the security guard still had his hand extended. Patricia was still staring at Simone. The hall still held that dense silence when someone at the entrance said loudly that they had called the police. It wasn't Patricia. It wasn't any of the employees. It was the red-haired woman who had pulled out her phone in the middle of the confusion and dialed before anyone noticed. She said she had been robbed and that there was a suspect being detained. She said this with the certainty of someone who believes they are doing the right thing, without imagining that she was being used in a play that had been written long before she entered the restaurant. The arrival of the police would give a new dimension to the situation, and Renato knew it. With police present, the version that reached the formal record first would have immense weight. And the version Patricia was building was simple, visual, and convincing. A man from the streets who had entered without authorization, who had been seen near a customer's bag, who had tried to be searched, and who had generated confusion with the help of an employee who needed to be disciplined. It was the easiest narrative, and there were people in the hall who had watched everything with the mental disposition of those who had already decided which side of the story they were on before any evidence was presented. Patricia then moved with an efficiency Renato had not anticipated. She turned to Simone and said in a clear voice that she was suspended until further notice and that she should leave her apron and exit through the employee entrance immediately. She said this before the police arrived, before any investigation, before any word from Renato. It was an attempt to remove the only witness from the hall before the situation took on official contours. Simone stood still for 2 seconds. Renato saw the calculation in her eyes, the job, the bills, her brother at home waiting for her. There was real weight in those 2 seconds. And then she removed her apron, folded it calmly, and placed it on the nearest table. But she didn't go toward the employee exit. She stayed where she was. Patricia repeated the order. Simone said she was waiting for the police to arrive because she had something to say to them. She said this with a slightly trembling voice, but her feet planted on the ground, as if she had decided that there was no force capable of moving her from there before she said what she had seen. The 2 police officers entered through the main entrance 4 minutes later. One was accustomed to that type of establishment by the formality with which he positioned himself upon entering, hat in hand, looking at the environment with the trained discretion of someone who had attended similar situations in similar locations. The other was younger, notebook in hand, eyes attentive. Patricia intercepted them before they reached Renato. She introduced herself as the manager in charge, gave a summary of the situation in less than 40 seconds. A customer had reported a lost bag. An individual without identification had entered without authorization, had been seen near the customer's table by 2 witnesses. There was an employee who had facilitated his entry and who was also being terminated for breach of protocol. The older officer listened to everything without interrupting. Then he asked if there were security cameras. Patricia said yes, that the system covered the entire hall. He said he would need to check the images from the period. Patricia replied that access to the system was in a restricted administrative area and that she would need authorization from the general manager to release it. The officer said that wasn't a request. It was a standard investigation procedure. Patricia said she understood, but that per the establishment's security protocol, the images could only be accessed through hierarchical authorization. The officer looked at her for a moment without saying anything. It was the kind of silence that exists between 2 people when one knows the other is stalling and the other knows the first one knows. Then he said he would need the general manager's contact and that in the meantime he didn't want anyone to leave the establishment. Patricia opened her phone. She made a call that lasted 12 seconds. Renato didn't hear what was said, but he saw her expression after hanging up. It wasn't the relief of someone who received support. It was the tension of someone who received a difficult instruction. Simone approached the officers with firm steps and said she had a statement to make. that she had witnessed an employee of the establishment pass behind the individual who was being accused at the exact moment the confusion about the bag had started, and that the movement had been deliberate and not accidental. The younger officer began to take notes. The older one looked at the waiter, Diego, who remained at the side of the hall with the tray, and asked him not to move away. Diego stood motionless, but something in his face changed, a minimal contraction around the eyes that those far away wouldn't see, but that Renato, who was observing him directly, saw clearly. The older officer then turned to Renato and said he needed his identification. Renato put his hand in the inner jacket pocket. He took out the expensive cell phone, and then he took out the wallet, which he had carried folded inside the inner lining with his real documents inside. He handed them to the officer. The officer looked at the documents. He looked at Renato. He looked at the documents again. And for the first time that night, it was someone else's expression that changed everything in the hall, because what the officer felt upon reading the name was not recognition of a face. It was recognition of a name he had seen somewhere, in a news report, in an article, on a restaurant sign. And that recognition passed through his face like a slow wave. Patricia, who had been standing 2 meters away observing, saw the officer's expression. And for the first time since she had entered the hall that night, Renato saw something he hadn't seen yet in the manager of Noir. He saw doubt. It wasn't regret. Not yet. It was just that initial crack that appears when someone who was absolutely sure of the script begins to suspect that the script might have a page they hadn't read. Patricia's jaw tightened slightly. She glanced at the back door, then back at the officer, then at Renato. And for the first time she couldn't maintain her indifference. The officer returned the documents to Renato without commenting out loud, but he said to Patricia, with a tranquility that sounded firmer than a shout, that he needed to see the cameras now, and that any obstacle to that access would be recorded in the report. He said they would go to the monitoring room together, her, the 2 officers, and any employee who had access to the system. Patricia said the general manager was on his way, and that it would be better to wait for him. The officer said the procedure doesn't wait for managers. He said this without arrogance, with the patience of someone who knows they have authority, and doesn't need to demonstrate it with volume of voice. In the hall, the customers no longer pretended they weren't watching. The background music had stopped at some point during the confusion, and the silence was now real, not just social. Some tables had already asked for the check. A young employee near the bar held a menu against her chest as if it were a protective object. The waiter Diego had retreated 2 steps toward the side corridor without anyone asking him to stay. A movement that said everything about what he knew and how much it weighed on him to know. Renato stood up from the chair slowly. He didn't say anything yet, but he stopped hunching his shoulders. He stopped holding the character's posture. And as Patricia followed the officers toward the corridor leading to the administration, he accompanied them with the naturalness of someone who belongs to the place, because he did belong more than anyone in that hall imagined. The corridor leading to the administration of Noir was narrow and lined with the same dark material as the facade, an aesthetic continuity that gave the sensation that the restaurant didn't end in the hall, but extended inside like a carefully illuminated labyrinth. Renato had walked that corridor a few times in the first months after the inauguration, when he still appeared at the restaurant regularly to follow the operation closely. Later, the visits became more spaced out as the group grew, and the need to manage the whole consumed the time he used to spend with the parts. Now he followed through the same corridor in thrift store clothes and a dusty face, 2 steps behind the officers and Patricia. Without anyone saying he could or could not follow, he just went, and no one stopped him. The monitoring room was the 3rd door on the right. Patricia used a magnetic card to open it. The older officer entered first, the younger one stayed at the door. The room was small, a counter with 2 monitors, a swivel chair, a rack with the recording equipment. It was a standard system for that type of establishment, full coverage of the hall, the entrance, the kitchen access corridor, and the parking lot in the back. Patricia said the system was going through a firmware update and that the images from the day might be compromised. She said this looking at the equipment, not at the officer. The officer said he needed to check personally. He sat in the chair, looked at the monitors, and began navigating the system with the familiarity of someone who had done it in other establishments. The cameras were working, all of them. The indicator in the corner of each screen showed active recording, and the history was intact. Patricia stood behind the officer with the expression of someone who had bet on a card that didn't pay off. But when the officer went to navigate to the file of the last 2 hours, he found something that made him stop. Not a technical failure, an absence. The cameras in the side corridor, precisely those covering the stretch between the parking lot entrance and the administration door, showed a block of 42 minutes with a frozen image. Not deleted. Frozen in a static frame, as if someone had paused the recording in that specific segment without pausing the rest of the system. The officer asked who had access to the monitoring system. Patricia said herself and the general manager. The officer asked who had manipulated the corridor camera. Patricia said she didn't know of any manipulation. The officer said the frozen image was manipulation. He said this in the same calm tone as before, without direct accusation, but without leaving doubt about what he understood had happened. Renato, who had remained standing at the entrance of the room, looked at the monitors. There was something he wasn't looking for there. He had gone to see the hall cameras, to have visual confirmation of what Diego had done. But what the frozen corridor suggested was another scale of thing. Not an individual action by an opportunistic employee. It was the use of the restaurant's own security system against the restaurant. Someone with enough access to pause specific cameras at a specific moment. The officer asked Patricia to stay in the room and sent the younger colleague back to the hall so that no one would leave while the investigation advanced. Then he turned to Renato and asked carefully if there was anything he needed to declare about the establishment. The way he asked made it clear that the officer had understood more than the simple fact of the name on the documents. He had understood the context. Renato replied that yes, there was, but that first he wanted to check something. There was a door at the back of the monitoring room that he didn't remember. He hadn't paid attention to it on previous visits, or maybe it didn't exist before, or maybe there simply had never been a reason to notice it. It was a metal door without a window, with a cylinder lock, the type of door that exists in restaurants for cold rooms or cleaning storage. Except it was in the middle of the administrative area, where cold rooms had no reason to be. Renato pointed to the door. He asked Patricia what was on the other side. She said it was a storage room for maintenance materials. She said this too fast, without the pause that precedes a true answer. The officer heard the speed of the response and asked her to open the door. Patricia said she didn't have the key, that it was with maintenance. The officer asked where the person responsible for maintenance was. She said he wasn't on shift. The officer said they would need the key or a tool to open it, and that he would wait while she provided one of the two options. At that moment, Patricia's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen with that expression of someone who needs to answer but knows they shouldn't, because answering in front of a police officer who is checking tampered cameras is exactly the kind of thing that increases suspicions. But the phone vibrated again and she answered, turning her body slightly as if an inch of distance offered privacy. Renato heard only a fragment, but the fragment was enough. It wasn't the voice of the person calling, whom he couldn't identify. It was Patricia's response, said in a low voice, but with an urgency that leaked through her control. She said the situation was not as planned, and that he needed to arrive soon. She hung up and stood with her back turned for 2 seconds before turning around. The officer looked at her. She looked at him. And then there was a light knock on the metal door at the back coming from inside. The three stood motionless for a second. Then the officer stood up from the chair calmly and went toward the door. He knocked twice and asked if someone was there. Silence. He knocked harder. He said it was the police. The silence lasted 3 seconds, and then came a voice, female, saying that yes, there was someone, and that the door had locked from the outside. The officer asked Patricia again to open the door. She said she would need to find the key. He said she had 2 minutes. She went out into the corridor. The officer stood in front of the metal door, arms crossed, and Renato stood a meter behind him, processing in silence each new piece of data that the night had thrown on the table. There was a person locked in a storage room inside the administrative area of his restaurant. A person who hadn't asked for help before, who only knocked when she heard the police's voice. This meant she had opted to remain in silence for some time, which in turn meant there was something in that situation that she didn't want to draw attention to herself until she understood who was on the outside. It was the logic of someone who mistrusted who might show up. Patricia returned with a small key. Her hands didn't shake, but there was a rigidity in them that betrayed the effort to keep them from shaking. The officer took the key, opened the door, and found a young woman in a kitchen jacket sitting on the floor with her back against a shelf of cleaning products. She looked up with that mixture of relief and caution of someone who doesn't yet know if the help that arrived is indeed safe. The officer asked her name. She said, "Fernanda." He asked if she was okay. She said yes, that she had been locked in. When he asked who had locked her in, she looked at Patricia and said nothing. But the silence was the clearest possible answer. Renato looked at that woman on the floor of the storage room and felt something click coldly and definitively. He didn't yet know her full name. He didn't know her exact role. He didn't know what she had seen or what she knew. But he knew she had been placed there to be kept out of the hall during the time the setup was developing. What she had witnessed before being locked in was likely exactly what Patricia didn't want reaching the ears of anyone with authority to act. Fernanda was led out of the storage room carefully by the younger officer, who had returned to the corridor when his colleague called him. She was a kitchen assistant. She had arrived for her shift at 6 o'clock as usual, and around 8 o'clock, she had witnessed something she couldn't explain as routine. She had seen Diego leave the kitchen with a tray and enter through the side door of the administration, which in itself was outside normal procedure, because kitchen employees did not have habitual access to the administrative area during service. She had mentioned it to a colleague who had remained silent. When she went to mention the subject to the head chef, Patricia had entered the kitchen 2 minutes later and told Fernanda there was an urgent task in the supply storage. She went in to check the inventory of a specific item, and the door was closed from the outside while she was still inside. She had knocked. No one had responded. The noise of the kitchen at peak hours was loud enough to drown out knocks on a metal door in an adjacent room. She had waited, sitting on the floor, listening to the muffled voices and movement outside, without fully understanding what was happening, but understanding enough to stay quiet when she wasn't sure who was on the outside. Renato heard all this standing at the entrance of the monitoring room. Each detail Fernanda added was a stone in a mosaic that was becoming increasingly clear. Diego had left the kitchen with a tray. Diego had entered the administration. What was there that justified a waiter's movement in the administration during the peak of a Friday service? The obvious answer was that there was nothing legitimate. The answer he still needed to confirm was what there was of illegitimate. The older officer said they needed to check the rest of the administrative area. He said this looking at Patricia, who had leaned against a point between the corridor door and the wall, phone in hand but without using it, in a position that seemed calculated to be simultaneously accessible to the exit and present enough to follow what was being said. There were 2 other doors in the administrative wing besides the monitoring room and the storage room where Fernanda had been. The first was the management office, which Patricia opened without resistance. A desk, a computer, files, the normal artifacts of restaurant management. Nothing that drew attention beyond the well-organized reports Renato knew in digital version. The second door was at the end of the corridor, almost hidden by a steel cabinet leaning against the wall at an angle. Renato had passed it twice without noticing, because the cabinet created a shadow that visually erased the frame. It was a heavier door than the others, with reinforced hinges and a different, more robust lock, the type used in areas that store something more valuable than office supplies. The officer asked what was behind that door. Patricia said it was access to the technical basement, where the air conditioning systems and electrical infrastructure were located. She said every building of that size on Oscar Freire had a technical basement, which was true. The officer said he needed to check. Patricia said she didn't have the key to that access, which was with the outsourced building maintenance company. She said this with a firmness that sounded rehearsed. Renato took a step forward. He told the officer that he was the owner of the property and the establishment, and that he authorized the opening of the door by any necessary means. He said this in a clear voice, looking at the officer, and then looked at Patricia with a care that was more revealing than any direct accusation, because it wasn't the look of an owner who discovered a dishonest employee. It was the look of a man who was mentally reconstructing 18 months of perfect reports and realizing, piece by piece, the size of what had been built in his absence. Patricia turned white, not in a dramatic way, in a real way, the kind of paleness that happens when the blood recedes, because the brain understood before the body that the game was over. The younger officer went to get tools from the car. He returned with a lock extractor. The door gave way in 8 minutes. The smell that came out when it opened was of stagnant air, slightly damp, with a metallic addition coming from the subfloor. The officer turned on his phone's flashlight and descended the first steps of a concrete staircase. Renato descended behind him. The basement was larger than the restaurant's floor plan suggested. There were pipes along the walls, the low hum of air conditioning compressors, circuit breaker boxes. All of that was there, exactly as Patricia had described. But there was another section, separated by an improvised partition of drywall sheets that were not original to the construction, with an opening without a door that led to a space organized in a way that had nothing to do with technical infrastructure. There were shelves. On the shelves, boxes without external identification. There was a work table with a locked drawer. There were, in a corner covered by a tarp, stacked objects that had familiar shapes, bags, folded coats, items that belonged to people. And there was, leaning against the back wall, a small steel safe, the portable type with a digital combination. The officer stood at the entrance of that space for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he called Central and asked for reinforcements and forensics. He said there was physical evidence that required proper collection protocol. He gave the address. He hung up. And then he turned to Renato with a look that wasn't of surprise, because officers with some time of experience are rarely surprised, but it was of a specific seriousness, the seriousness of someone who is about to have a very long night. Renato stood looking at the shelves, the boxes, the tarp covering the stacked objects. He had built Noir as the top of his group, the restaurant that represented everything he had achieved. And there, below, literally underneath all that, was something that wasn't his, that he had never authorized, that had grown in the darkness while the reports continued perfectly upstairs. He thought about the 18 months since Helio Drummond had promoted Patricia. He thought about Helio's reports, which arrived every Monday with an almost mechanical consistency, always with good news, always with clear justifications for any number that deviated slightly from what was expected. He thought about how many times he had looked at those reports and thought he had chosen well in delegating. He had delegated, yes, but he hadn't verified. And between delegating and verifying, there was a space that someone had filled with something he didn't yet fully understand, but already knew was larger than a single ambitious manager acting alone. The younger officer returned to the monitoring room to wait for reinforcements and keep Patricia on site. Renato stayed for a moment longer in the basement, looking at the space like an archaeologist before something that was buried with intention. Then he climbed the steps slowly, reached the corridor and went toward the hall, because there was a person in there who had stood in the middle of all that without having asked to participate, and who now had her employment formally terminated by order of a manager, who would soon have much bigger problems than Renato's opinion of her. The hall had partially emptied. Some tables had already asked for the check and left, with the discreet haste of someone who doesn't want to be associated with a scandal in a public place. Others remained, either out of curiosity or because the younger officer had asked those present to stay until a minimum protocol for collecting information was fulfilled. There was a climate of suspension in the air, like in a theater play during intermission, when the actors have left but the set is still assembled. Simone was sitting in one of the corner chairs, the same one where she had placed Renato earlier. She had removed her apron by Patricia's order but hadn't gone away. She stayed there with her hands in her lap, like someone who decided to finish what they started, even without yet knowing how it ends. The younger officer had taken note of her statement and asked her to wait. Renato crossed the hall toward her, still in the worn clothes, the dusty face, the faded jacket. The difference was the posture. There was no longer a hunch in the shoulders, no longer the lowered gaze of the character. He walked with the direct step of someone who belongs to the place, and the few people still at the tables observed him with that attention that arises when something in someone's behavior doesn't fit what the eyes are seeing. Simone raised her head when he got close. She looked at him with an expression that tried to decipher what had changed, because something had clearly changed, but she didn't yet have the pieces to put it together. Renato pulled up a chair and sat in front of her. He said she was fired by a person who had no authority to fire anyone, at least not for that reason and not in that way. He said she would have her job back if she wanted, in better conditions than the current ones, and that he would formally apologize for what had happened that night within her own establishment. Simone looked at him without fully understanding. She said he had no way of knowing that Patricia was the manager and that she did have authority. He replied that Patricia was in the monitoring room with the police and that her authority over anything related to Noir had ended that night. He said this not with satisfaction, but with the sobriety of someone reporting a fact. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Who are you?" He said the name. Renato Cavalcante. Just the name without the rest, because the rest would come on its own when she connected it. It did. She remained in silence for about 3 seconds, with the expression of someone reorganizing the entire narrative of the last hour with a new piece of information. Then she said with a voice that had lost its contained calm and gained something closer to incredulity, that he had entered his own restaurant in disguise. He confirmed it. She said she had brought him bread and broth. He said it had been the best service of the night. She let out a sound that wasn't a laugh or a cry, but something in between. The kind of reaction that happens when someone is emotionally overloaded and relief arrives from an angle they weren't expecting. Renato said there was something he needed to understand. He asked why she had stayed. Not stayed in the restaurant after being dismissed, which was already enough courage, but why she had said what she had seen, knowing the risk. She could have kept quiet. Most people would. Simone looked at her hands for a moment before responding. She said she had a brother, that he had gone through a health problem 2 years ago that had left him with limitations and that he needed care and financial support that she was the only one to provide. She said the job at Noir wasn't what she dreamed of, that the environment had worsened in the last months in a way she couldn't fully explain, but felt in every shift. She said she had thought about quitting several times, and that what held her back was exactly that. Her brother's health insurance bill, the apartment rent, the stability of a predictable salary. Then she said that when she saw Diego pass behind him with his arm extended, she had felt something that was stronger than calculation. She felt that if she stayed quiet at that moment, she was going to carry that for a long time, that there are things that weigh in a way that doesn't go away, and that silencing oneself before a deliberate injustice was one of them. Renato heard everything without interrupting. He had hired people for years. He had heard hundreds of stories from employees in selection processes, in performance reviews, in conversations in the corridors of his restaurants. He knew how to distinguish who was performing and who was being real. Simone was real. Each of her words had the specific weight of something that hadn't been prepared for an audience. When she finished, he said her brother would be covered. That adequate health assistance would be provided regardless of any professional decision she made, that this wasn't compensation for what had happened that night. It was recognition that she had borne a real cost by doing the right thing, and that it wasn't fair for her to carry that cost alone. She opened her mouth to say something, closed it, looked at her hands again. Then she said she didn't know how to thank him. He said she didn't need to thank him for anything, that he had entered Noir that night to discover what was wrong with the place. And he had discovered what was wrong, but he had also discovered what was right, and that he hadn't expected to find. It was at that moment that the main door of the restaurant opened and Helio Drummond entered. He wore a dark blazer over a shirt without a tie, the look of someone who was called urgently and got ready quickly, but with the care not to arrive completely undone. He was 52 years old, grey hair combed to the side, the straight posture of someone used to arriving in environments and having people adjust to their presence. He had been Renato's trusted man for 6 years. He had built the group's growth from 4 to 10 establishments together. He knew every number, every contract, every supplier. He entered the hall with his eyes sweeping the environment, evaluating. He saw the police, he saw Simone, he saw Renato, and he stopped. The recognition was immediate, despite the clothes and the dusty face. Helio knew Renato too long to be fooled by an old jacket, and the expression that passed through his face in that second was not surprise. It was something different, something Renato identified with the precision of someone who knows a face well. It was the calculation of someone trying to decide in real time which version of the story still has salvation. Helio crossed the hall toward Renato with his composure intact. He asked what had happened, with the usual tone of a manager arriving to resolve a situation, as if it were any Friday with a minor incident to handle, as if he hadn't received the call from Patricia, as if he didn't know what was in the basement. Renato didn't respond immediately. He let the silence work for a few seconds. Then he said with a calm voice that Helio needed to be very careful with what he was going to say next. Helio frowned with the expression of someone who doesn't understand the observation. He said he had been called because there was a problem at Noir and that he was there to help resolve it, as he had always done. He said, as he had always done, with emphasis, the emphasis of someone trying to put on the table, the capital of trust accumulated over 6 years so that it would function as a shield. Renato said he had gone down to the basement. He said this and watched Helio's face, and what he saw confirmed what he had already begun to suspect when Patricia had said on the phone that the situation had blown up. Helio knew about the basement. The question wasn't if he knew. The question was how long he had known and what exactly was the size of what he knew. Helio remained in silence for 4 seconds. In 6 years of living together, Renato had learned that Helio's silence was always calculated. He didn't stay silent for lack of an answer. He stayed to choose which answer to use, and 4 seconds was too long for someone with a clean conscience. When he spoke, his voice had changed slightly. It had lost its administrative tone and gained something more careful, more personal, as if he were consciously switching registers. He said there were things happening in the group that Renato needed to understand in the right context, that there were pressures he faced that he had never brought to bother the owner, that there were decisions that seemed difficult to explain, but that had logic if you knew the whole. Renato said he was listening. Helio said there were partners who had approached the group in the last 2 years, who had made proposals that seemed advantageous, and that involved the use of the restaurant's physical spaces in a way he judged wouldn't be a problem as long as it didn't affect visible operation. He said he had judged poorly. He said the situation had escalated beyond what he had foreseen, and that he himself was looking for a way to end that arrangement without damage. It was the most carefully wrapped confession Renato had heard in his life. Each word chosen to minimize without lying openly, to admit without naming, to place responsibility on the scale and context instead of on individual decisions. It was the speech of an intelligent man trying to negotiate the size of his own failure while there was still time. Renato said only, "Other restaurants." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And the way Helio didn't respond immediately confirmed what the statement already said. The lawyer Claudio Mendes entered the hall at that exact moment. He had arrived by taxi, unbuttoning his blazer as he walked, with that way of a professional accustomed to arriving in situations already in motion. He greeted Renato with a quick handshake, evaluated the environment in seconds, and asked what was needed. Renato said he needed him to stay and listen to everything that came next, because he would need a formal record of every word said from then on. Claudio opened the laptop he had brought in his bag and stood beside Renato. The older officer reappeared from the corridor and approached the group. He said the forensics team had arrived and was going down to the basement. He also said that based on what had been found so far, the situation would require a broader investigation and that he would need a formal statement from the property owner that night. He looked at Renato as he said this. Renato said he was available. Then the officer looked at Helio and said he would need identification and that he should remain on site to provide statements as well. Helio took his documents out of his pocket with slow movements, like someone weighing each action, each gesture, each thing that can still be undone and each thing that no longer can. Renato turned to the hall. There were still about 15 people in the space, between customers who stayed, employees who waited, and 2 experts who had passed quickly through the hall toward the corridor. The red-haired woman, who had started that entire chain with the bag report, was sitting with her hands crossed over the table, the expression of someone who had come in for dinner and found themselves in the middle of something much larger than a lost bag. Renato walked over to her. He said he regretted what had happened to her belongings and that the restaurant assumed full responsibility for the situation. He said she would be fully reimbursed and that a contact from the group would get in touch with her in the coming days. The woman looked at him with that expression that mixes relief and embarrassment because she had pointed at him with certainty 2 hours earlier and now knew she had been manipulated into doing so. He said he understood and that it was not her fault. She had been placed in that position intentionally and the intention was not hers. After that, Renato went to the center of the hall. He stood in the middle of the space he had designed to be the top of everything he had built. He looked at the dark wood ceiling, at the white flowers in the tall vases, at the amber lighting that spilled warm light over the empty tables. There was something painful in all that, not for the material loss but for the kind of betrayal it is to discover that something you built with care was used as a shell to house something you would never have allowed. But there was also, growing beneath the pain, something he recognized as clarity. The clarity of someone who finally saw what was hidden and knows they can now act. There were no more too perfect reports to examine. There were facts. There was evidence in the process of being catalogued 3 floors below. There was a general manager who had just admitted in careful but unequivocal terms that he had made agreements he had no authorization to make. And there were other restaurants to check. Simone was still sitting in the corner. She had observed everything without moving, with that quiet attention of someone still processing. When Renato returned in her direction, she said she hadn't yet fully understood everything that had happened. He said it would take some time to fully understand even for him. But he said one thing was already clear, that Noir was going to go through a complete transformation, and that when it reopened, it was going to need people who understood what it was to treat someone with dignity, regardless of how that person was dressed or how much money they appeared to have. She stayed in silence for a moment. Then she said she still wanted to work at the restaurant if the offer still stood. He said it did. He also said the position was hers to define, because she had shown more leadership that night than anyone with a management title in the establishment. From the corridor, the officer's voice came calling Renato for the formalization of the statement. He went, but before entering the corridor, he stopped at the entrance and looked at the hall one last time. It was almost midnight. Noir was almost empty, illuminated by the same amber light as always, with the white flowers in the tall vases and the music, which someone had turned back on at a low volume without anyone asking. It was a beautiful place. It had been built with real care, and it would continue to be beautiful, except that from then on, what supported the facade was going to have to be as solid as the facade, because he had learned that Friday, in the most direct way possible, that luxury without substance is just scenery, and that scenery collapses when you push the wrong wall. While Claudio prepared the formal notes and the officer organized the statement protocol, Renato stood in the corridor for one more instant. He thought of the dented white Goal parked 2 blocks away. He thought of the thrift store clothes he had bought 3 days earlier. He thought of everything he had planned when entering there that night, in an operation that should have lasted 2 hours and that had turned into something that would take months to be completely resolved. He had entered wanting to discover what was wrong, and he had discovered it. But he had also discovered in a humble corner of the group's most luxurious hall that there were people working for a fair wage with more integrity than executives with a badge and a title. And that discovery weighed as much as everything he had found in the basement. The investigation would reveal in the following weeks that the scheme involved 3 of his restaurants, that Helio had made agreements with intermediaries who used the spaces during off-peak hours to store objects of questionable origin, that Patricia had been recruited by Helio to keep the team intimidated and keep curious employees away from sensitive areas, and that Diego was the operational link between the hall and the basement. Everything would come to light gradually, documented, irrefutable. But that night Renato knew only enough to feel the full weight of what he had found, and he also knew what he was going to do next. Noir closed for 93 days. It wasn't a dramatic decision announced in a press conference. It was a silent choice Renato made on the morning following the longest Friday of his adult life, sitting on the balcony of his apartment with a cup of coffee that went cold before being drunk, looking at the city as it began to lighten and thinking about what kind of place that restaurant should be when it reopened, if it reopened. Reopen, he concluded, because closing for good would be yielding to the bad version of the story, and he had spent his whole life refusing the bad versions. During the 93 days, Noir underwent a complete audit, conducted by an external company with no previous connection to the Cavalcante group. Every contract, every supplier, every financial record of the 18 months of Halio Drummond's management were examined. The basement was emptied and documented by the authorities. The belongings found were catalogued, and the process of restitution to the legitimate owners was initiated, a slow and meticulous work that Renato's legal team coordinated together with the competent authorities. Halio responded formally for the irregularities. There was no way to build a defense that would survive the volume of evidence found, and the process that followed was extensive, as these processes invariably are, but the result left no room for interpretation. Patricia also responded for what she had done, including the matter of Fernanda, who had been locked in a storage room during a work shift, something for which there was documentary record and consistent testimony. Diego cooperated with the authorities, and his situation was handled within the larger process. The waiter, who had tried to expel Renato at the entrance, and who had been just a poorly trained employee within a permissive culture created by his superiors, was kept on the condition of undergoing a complete retraining process, along with all the staff who remained. Because there was a difference, Renato had learned that night to distinguish more clearly between those who are bad by choice and those who become careless by example. The first has no solution within a company. The second does if the example changes. The reopening happened on a Tuesday in September, without an event, without press, without an opening cocktail. Just the doors open and the service running. Renato arrived earlier than any employee, opened the restaurant in the dark, turned on the lights, and stood in the center of the empty hall for a few minutes. The same dark ceiling, the same white flowers, the same amber lighting. But there was something different that wasn't in the walls or the furniture. It was in those who were going to work there. Simone had accepted the position of hospitality coordinator, a new role Renato had created specifically from what he had observed that night. It wasn't a management role in the conventional sense. It was the role of someone whose primary responsibility was to ensure that every person who crossed Noir's door was treated as a human being before any other classification. It was a position that, Renato had realized, should have existed from day one, and he had simply given it the name of the person who had proven to be the most qualified to exercise it. She arrived that Tuesday morning with her hair tied back as always, the same way of walking of someone who carries the shift with their shoulders but doesn't let that show on their face. She found Renato in the hall and they stayed there for a moment without saying much, because there was a whole story between those two presences that didn't need words to exist. Her brother was well. The health plan had been provided as promised, and the first months of adequate coverage had already made a visible difference in his condition. Simone hadn't mentioned it again after the night she told him, but Renato knew. He had followed from afar, with the care of someone who wants to help without turning the help into a weight the other person needs to carry. The first customer to enter Noir that Tuesday was an elderly woman who had made a reservation through the website without knowing it was the reopening day. She arrived with a book under her arm, asked for a table for one, had lunch alone for an hour and a half, and left a handwritten note in the suggestion box saying it had been the most peaceful lunch she had had in months. Renato kept that note. Not because it was the best compliment he had ever received for one of his restaurants, but because it was exactly the kind of thing Noir should produce, and that it had stopped producing for a time. He didn't need to measure to know was too long. In the following months, the audit process extended to the other restaurants in the group. Two presented minor irregularities linked to suppliers with connections that shouldn't exist. One presented more serious irregularities, and that one also closed temporarily for restructuring. The others passed through the review without significant problems, which was a genuine relief because there was a part of Renato that had feared finding the basement in all of them. He didn't find it. But the verification process itself had already been worth it, because what had failed at Noir wasn't just Halio or Patricia or Diego. It was Renato's absence. It was the space he had left by believing that delegating well was the same as being present. He had learned in the most concrete way possible that it is not. That there is a fundamental difference between trusting and verifying. And that the people you hire deserve to be seen, not just managed. Because when no one truly looks, what grows in the space between reports can be anything. Simone once said in a team meeting that dignified treatment is not a favor an establishment does for the customer. It is the minimum floor of any relationship between people. And that if a team cannot maintain that floor when they believe no one important is looking, then the problem is not one of training, it is one of values. And values are not installed in a manual. They are demonstrated every day, especially when no one is looking. Renato had listened and said nothing. He had internally noted that he was paying the right person to say that. Noir continued. Oscar Freire continued. The Cavalcante Gastronomia group continued, with closer supervision, with more frequent visits, and, every now and then with Renato entering through a side door without warning, not disguised, not acting out anything, just present. Because he had discovered that real presence, without a script and without an agenda, was the most effective way to understand what is actually happening in any place you built. And he had discovered also that among all the people he had crossed that Friday at Noir, the only one who had acted exactly as she would have acted if she knew the owner was looking was precisely the only one who didn't know. That was the simplest definition of character he had found in 46 years, and it hadn't come from a book or a course or a consultancy. It had come from a woman with a white apron and a tray in her hand, in a corner of a restaurant, on a night when everyone chose not to see. If this story reached you in some way, whether through voice, screen, or the silence of a dawn when you needed something to hear, know that it was told with the care of someone who believes that stories like this need to exist. Stories that remind us that what you do when no one looks is who you really are. If it touched something inside you, if it made you think of someone you know who deserved more, or a situation that should have been different, leave it in the comments. We want to hear. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now, because here we tell stories every day about real people, difficult decisions, and the silent courage that no one photographs, but that changes everything. Hit the like, share it with someone who needs to remember that character is not what you show, it's what you are. We'll meet in the next story. End of story.